Hello and good morning. This is Lieutenant Rachel Johnson at the Salvation Army, and I want to welcome you to church. I shared 2 weeks ago when we did another sermon that it felt weird to say welcome to church because when I usually say those words, I'm looking at a congregation of people, and right now I'm looking at a screen. I'm actually looking at myself, which is even stranger, but it's I wish truthfully that I was looking at people in our congregation and seeing their faces, and I'm remembering fondly this morning the way that they look at me when I say something that they like and the way that they look at me when I say something that they don't like. And I am looking forward to that day. I think we all are. When we can be together again. But in the meantime, I want to encourage everyone who's listening to not let this season be in vain. It's not often that God stops the whole world really from working and living, and we've had this incredible paradigm shift in the way that we live and worship and work, and so I just encourage you to try to tune in to the voice of God to see what He is saying about this season and what He is doing in this season. Speaking of that, tonight at 6 o'clock, our church is going to have a Zoom testimony meeting where we're all going to get on and we're going to share a little bit about what God is doing in this season for us, what He's been talking to us about, what He's saying in our devotional times, and just in general, what new version of ourselves is emerging from this season. And so if you're interested in being a part of that, just send us a message on Facebook and we will happily send you the Zoom invite. But let's get to the message this morning. This morning, we're talking about the uncertainty of obedience. And I believe that even saying that, you can recall times in your life when being obedient has been a very uncertain thing for you. You can't really see what's going to happen 5 steps down the road. You don't really know what exactly saying yes to God entails. And there is a ton of uncertainty in being obedient. Is it worth all of that? Absolutely, 1000%. But it's still scary. And there's a lot of uncertainty in being obedient to God. And this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about this morning. First, I'd like you to turn in your Bibles to Matthew 26, 36 through 46. That's Matthew 26, 36 through 46. And it says this: Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go up there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is sorrowful, even to the point of death. Remain here and watch with me." And getting a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but as you will." And then he came to the disciples and found them asleep. And he said to Peter, "So you could not watch with me just 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the body is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass from me, I drink it. Your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words again. And then he came to the disciples and said to them, "See, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. See, my betrayer is at hand." March 25th, 2018 was a very, very special day on the Christian calendar. For the first time in 73 years, Annunciation Day, the day that the church celebrates when the angel Gabriel visited a very special young girl named Mary, and as we know, changed her life and the world forever. The fact that Annunciation Day landed on Palm Sunday in 2018 presented some very compelling connections that we should not miss. These connections provide such a beautiful backdrop for the central question that is our theme for this morning. What does obedience to God look like? What role has obedience played in my life? What role will obedience play in my life? Obedience, our life should be marked with obedience to God. If there's anything we know and have come to appreciate about Mary, is that she was obedient. She said yes to God, even though she was afraid. And as we can understand, she was doubtful. She was 14, pregnant, and unwed. Even if there would have been a number of reasons for her to say no, and in fact, she had said no to God, we probably wouldn't have blamed her, given how fearful and doubtful she was. But praise God, Mary said yes, and hopefully, maybe there are already people in your sphere of influence who are very happy that you were obedient to God, because in your obedience, their lives are changed. Much like Mary's obedience to God, our lives are changed. Because she was obedient to God, regardless of the cost, the pain and the suffering that she would endure, she changed her life forever and thus changed the world forever. Fast forward 33 years from that moment that she said yes, there was another scene of another person who was caught with a decision to make. We get the opportunity to make a lot of decisions in our lives. But this one is not between an angel and a young girl, but with Jesus, the son of Mary, in the Garden of Gethsemane. Here he is, facing the very same kinds of questions that his very own mother faced at the moment the angel visited her and he was conceived. The very same choice between comfort and obedience, between self-preservation or self-sacrifice, between doing his will or doing the will of God. There is a war between the will of Jesus or the will of God. You may see yourself in this very description too. There have been many times in my own life that I can recall. It's been a serious battle of the wills. It's interesting though, he could have said anything. Jesus could have said anything. But the words that he chose to speak were this: "My Father, if possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not what I will, but as you will." Many of us have heard that prayer before. Maybe we've even said those words before. Yet not what I will, but as you will. Maybe today we need to say those words. Maybe today we need to mean those words. Or maybe today you need to put some footwork to those wills. Not what I will, but what you will. Look at the way that Jesus begins this prayer. My Father, which in the original Greek language was Abba, which in the most literal translation means dad. This was Jesus praying in the most intimate way possible with God. In that moment, he was speaking from the heart and not from tradition or from formula. This was Jesus in the raw, Jesus in the real, and Jesus being vulnerable. And he chose to appeal to God just like you and I have appealed to our moms and dads in our times of need and discomfort. The first part of that prayer is crystal clear. And so is the last part of the prayer. The way that he concludes the prayer simply says, "Not my will, but yours be done. Not what I want, but what you want." It's very clear that regardless of the stress that he was feeling in his body, no matter how fearful or how doubtful he may have been, his conclusion was clear. He was determined to do the will of God, come what may, no matter what. Even as you may know, or you may not know, and that's fine too, even until death. So if obedience this morning, your obedience to God, was a spectrum, where would you lie? Completely obedient to God in all things, or not obedient to God at all? Where do you fall? Where do you fall? As I shared in the first part, as I shared previously, the first part of this prayer is crystal clear, and the last part of the prayer is too. But what I find so very interesting is that the part in the middle is not. Specifically, the part that I find interesting is where Jesus says, let this cup pass from me. What a very interesting word choice. Let this cup pass from me. So what does Jesus mean when he says, let this cup pass from me? Was this a symbolic cup or a literal cup? What was Jesus, referring to? And most importantly for us, what does this cup have anything to do with obedience? And what difference should it make to us as followers of Christ? The common way that we would have understood those words in that cup Jesus was praying about represented agony, anguish, and suffering. You might even say that it also represented God's wrath or God's punishment. That's the common way that the image of a cup is used throughout the whole Bible. For example, if you look at the prophet Habakkuk or the Epistle of Paul's, over and over again, there's a cup that is referenced to, and the image represents the fullness of God's wrath and punishment upon humanity. This cup would have been, for Jesus, all of the agony and suffering that he would take upon himself and the sin of the whole world. So we've commonly understood that this very human Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane that night was wrestling deep within his spirit, as I'm sure we all have. When are those times that you have wrestled deep within your spirit? Maybe on the brink of obedience, maybe halfway through obedience, maybe we've been obedient to God and it's not at all what we expected or wanted or even desired. We've all wrestled with our flesh. So Jesus was thinking about all the things that this cup would represent. All of the things that this cup would represent. So think about this. Try to hear these sounds, try to smell these smells, and try to pretend like you are on the outskirts listening to this. Every whip crack, every single punch to the face, every single side-eye glance, every single spit upon the face, every single thorn pressed upon his brow, and every single nail piercing to the flesh. That's what that cup would represent. And I'll say it one more time. Think it through. Try to hear the snaps of a whip. Try to hear Jesus crying out in pain. Try to hear Jesus wailing for help. Try to see those who he is passing by laughing, and the side eyes, and the silence from people who did not help him. Try to think about all of the elements of this scene. Every whip crack, every single punch to the face, every single side-eye glance, every single spit upon the face, every single thorn pressed upon his brow, and every single nail piercing to the flesh. Let this cup pass from me. When Jesus was saying those words, he was really saying, Dad, I don't know if I really want to do this part of the mission. In fact, if there is another way to fulfill your purpose without the cross, can we please take that route? But maybe there is another way to even look at the cup. There's a book by a wonderful Catholic theologian called The Fourth Cup. His conclusion is deeply profound and dramatically unlocks a new meaning and understanding of what Jesus was really praying for with the cup in the Garden of Gethsemane. It begins with a reminder that this story is from the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew was writing to predominantly Jewish audience, Jews or Christians who were once Jews, which means that the people who originally heard Matthew's version of the gospel would have been very, very, very familiar with Jewish customs, symbolism, and imagery. They would have immediately recognized that a few hours before the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus would have been practicing what they call the Passover meal. The Great Passover meal is not just any meal. It's a meal of remembrance that had specific instructions for people to follow that would have been followed for generations and generations and centuries and centuries. In fact, Jews today still practice the same structure and order of the Passover meal. So we remember that the instructions for the Passover that Jesus followed were crystal clear. He knew them. He had been practicing them for centuries. We have them too, traditions that we practice for centuries and centuries and generations. The Passover meal involved prayers and retelling of stories. They involved the eating of a meal, and they involved cups. The order of the meal is essentially divided into 4 parts, much like quarters of a football game or a basketball game. The first section is the opening, the welcome to the meal. It involves a dish of herbs and cup, and the first cup is the cup of blessing. The words instruct the host to say a blessing over the meal as a way of setting the whole tone for the meal. So the first quarter is the blessing. The second section involves retelling of the Passover story. It's a reminder to everybody at the table that God has been good, and that he is and the things that he has done centuries ago, like freeing the Israelites from slavery to Pharaoh and led them into freedom through the wilderness and into the promised land. And that story is recounted. There is a second cup, the cup of remembrance. It is blessed, and then it is drunk. The third part of the meal, the bigger part of the meal, is where the food is actually eaten. It includes delicious lamb and unleavened bread. And maybe by now you're getting a little hungry. Now, the Catholic theologian says, and he concluded, that the third part of the Passover meal is where Jesus goes, as he says, off script. Isn't that so like Jesus? He starts improvising and he makes his own instructions. He goes rogue, as they say. In the third part of the meal, he takes the unleavened bread and says something the disciples have never heard before in all of their Passover meal experiences. He says, "This bread is me. Whenever you break the bread, you'll remember what I have done for you." But Jesus is really just getting started. After he takes that bread, he lifts it up, and then he takes the third cup and says something the disciples have also never heard before in all of their Passover meals experiences. He says, "This cup is my blood poured out for you and for the many, for the forgiveness of sins." If the disciples knew how Passover meals went, which they did, they were probably, rightfully so, concerned and a little scared what Jesus was doing and where he was going with all of this blood and cup and bread talk. It's like following a tradition your whole life, and then all of a sudden, your parents change it. Change is hard, even when it's initiated by Jesus. But regardless of how surprised the disciples must have been in that moment, it was nothing compared to the surprise that was coming. Then they got the fourth and final part of the Passover meal. In the fourth part of the meal, it involves the singing of a hymn. Traditionally, the words that are sung come straight out of Psalm 114 through 118, and it's a song called The Great Hallel, a great praise. Psalm 114 through Psalm 118. And we actually want to encourage you this week, as we start Holy Week, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. We want you to read, everyone who's watching, to read Psalm 114 through 118 this week, just recounting and remembering the goodness of God. So it's a retelling, like I said, of all God's promises and saving acts to the people of God all throughout history, including their freedom from Pharaoh and their leading through the wilderness into the promised land. But Matthew is very clear in his gospel that when Jesus and the disciples got to the fourth meal, they did sing that song, but then Jesus stopped the meal. Remember, we say he went off script. He cut it short and did not offer the fourth because it was not yet finished. For those who know what's coming, you probably heard what I did not say. The story of God's saving love is not yet complete. I can just imagine the disciples saying to Jesus, "Are you forgetting something? Do you need help? Do you remember how this goes?" It would probably have felt unresolved and incomplete, but not to Jesus. Nothing is ever a surprise to Jesus. So when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's praying that prayer to his dad, perhaps the more accurate translation of this prayer would have been, "Dad, if there is no other way to complete this story," maybe in the same way that we plead with our parents for a different consequence, "if there is no other way to fulfill your mission, if there is no other way to do your will than for me to become the fourth and final cup, then I'm ready." But let's not read here that Jesus was trying to get out of his purpose or his mission. Not at all. He was not trying to get out of this. He was just being honest that he was scared yet determined. Two emotions live in the same place. This was a Jesus who was clear that there was a mission to complete and there was a fourth cup to drink, and that cup had to be him. In fact, if you looked at Matthew's gospel, he gives us a hint just a few verses before, in verse 29, when he said to the disciples that he would not drink of the fruit of the vine until the mission was complete. And later, when he's been hanging on the cross, Jesus says the words, "I'm thirsty." Now, the other gospels say that too, but Matthew is the only one to record that when Jesus was offered sour wine and vinegar to drink, Jesus refused it. And why would he do that? Because there wasn't a fourth cup. It was his body that needed to be poured out. And that's why in the very moment that he died, he breathed his last breath and he said, "It is finished." The only cup that would have been sufficient would have been that of his own body poured out for us as the fourth and final cup. And Jesus was ready. Jesus was ready, which encourages us to ask ourselves that question. Am I ready for whatever God has for me? For the cost of obedience, am I ready? Which brings us back to Mary, the model of obedience. When Annunciation Day and the Palm Sunday fell on the same day, it is clear to us that Jesus is praying when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was not only praying to his dad, but he was probably also thinking about his mom. I'd like to think that on this day when Jesus was wrestling with the greatest decision of his life, he remembered that someone within his own family wrestled with the very same decision. It's common and important to think about all the people who have gone before us, modeling obedience, no matter what. His own mother, who chose in a way to become a cup herself, a vessel through which God's grace and love would be poured out through her for the benefit of all humanity. His own mother decided to carry within herself the blessing of God's love for the world. She too would offer herself in obedience to God's will. And where in the world would Jesus learn how to do that but through his mother? The children are watching, and they're learning from us. That's why the journey ahead is so important. That's why Holy Week that lies before us is so critical. This week is a reminder of the great lengths that Jesus went to become the fourth and final cup for the completion of your salvation. Psalm 114 through 118. Its words constitute a great hymn that was probably sung by Jesus and his disciples on that night to remind them and us of God's saving grace. And in Luke 1:46 through 55, we encourage you this week to read those words that Mary sang before she came to a point of obedience to God. And remember that these words are for you too. And with that, I want to welcome you to Holy Week, the week that we remember, we reflect and we mourn on Friday and we rejoice on Sunday, the resurrection of God. And this week, as you think about Holy Week, I encourage you to take a posture that allows you to really reflect and tune in to the significance of the death and the resurrection of Christ. Whether that's staying away from the computer this week or turning off your phone or not watching TV, anything that could stand in your way of really acknowledging and recognizing the significance of this week, we encourage you to do. So usually we have a response time in our church. We call that the heart work, where we ask God to transform our hearts and make us more like him so that we can leave church different than when we came, because we know that that is the point. We don't come to church to listen to a message and to hear songs and to see people, although those things are important. We come to church to be changed. And so we want to know how you've been changed. We want to know what this message meant to you and what you're wrestling with and dealing with for the sake of obedience. And if you want to talk through that with either Lieutenant Aaron or I, you can send us a Facebook message or call us at the Salvation Army. But we want to encourage you to be obedient to God, no matter what uncertainty comes from that. So we hope that you enjoyed this message, and we'll see you for our next sermon on Friday. God bless you.